Okay, so welcome back, guys. Before the break, we had completed the 5 steps of risk assessment, and we just discussed when to review the risk assessment. Okay, moving on now. Earlier on, we discussed about special cases and vulnerable workers, and we discussed various groups of vulnerable people that we need to take care of when we do a risk assessment. The first category of vulnerable people, which we are going to discuss, is young persons, young workers. Young workers are considered workers under the age of 18. Now, young workers, they are considered vulnerable because they have certain limitations. Now, some of those limitations are number one, lack of experience. They don't have enough experience and they don't know about the exact hazards of the job. Number two, they are physically and mentally immature. So physical and mental maturity is an issue with the young workers because most of the young workers, they are not developed mentally and physically as well. So this is another limitation. Obviously, they have poor risk perception. Young workers have not been exposed to various hazards, and we discussed previously how risk perception is developed. So if you haven't been exposed to a certain activity or a certain hazard, you will not have good perception. If you have been exposed to a certain hazard or a risk, you will have a good perception about that. They can be easily influenced by peer group pressure because they are young, unexperienced. They can easily be influenced by their peers. They are eager, and in their eagerness, they might put themselves at risk of being injured. Um, the control measures for young workers is number one, we should prohibit them from carrying out certain high risk activities, such as working on high risk machinery. We should also restrict their working patterns and working hours, and that means we should not give them overtime, and they need to be properly trained and supervised as well. Okay, next special group of people we need to consider is new and expectant mothers. Now, new and expectant mothers, they cannot be exposed to certain chemicals, for example, lead, because lead has a potential to, number one, it will not only injure the or cause ill health in the mother, but also in the unborn child as well. It can affect the fetus as well. So that is something which we should avoid at all cost. Then there are certain biological agents such as rubella virus. Again, this can spread from the mother to the child. There is no protection for that. Then manual handling. When what you call it, females get pregnant, they cannot carry out manual handling properly because their size will increase. It will be a bit difficult for them to bend and pick materials as well. So we should avoid manual handling activities for new and expectant mothers. Um, we cannot expose them to temperature extremes. We should also avoid whole body vibration because vibration, it disrupts your blood flow, and disruption of blood flow can be seriously damaging to the unborn child. We should avoid ionizing radiation. Often when you go for an X-ray, you will see a picture of a pregnant mother with a cross over it. So usually pregnant or expecting mothers are not allowed to be exposed to excessive radiation. Night shifts, again, we should avoid working them in night shifts. They can be at threat of stress or violence as well. So these are these, what you call it, limitations of new and expectant mothers, which we need to consider when we carry out a risk assessment. Then there are disabled workers. They have their own limitations. For example, we need to make sure that the workers who are disabled, they are given a job which suits them. Okay, so we need to look at the health and fitness criteria of the jobs. For example, there are some jobs which require good eyesight requirements. For example, driving. So we cannot allow people with poor eyesight to be drivers because they will cause accidents. Similarly, there will be certain activities which need manual labor. So we cannot expose disabled people to manual labor because they cannot physically get up and bend down and pick loads, etc. So you need to look at the job and you need to identify a fitness criteria for that job. You should also identify who are the workers with known disabilities, and you need to understand what are the implications of their disabilities. Another problem with which we need to consider for disabled people is if they are working at a higher level in the building. For example, they're working on a third or the fifth floor. Okay, normally they can go in an elevator and go up and down, but in an emergency, what happens? The elevators are usually shut off. The power to the elevators is disconnected. So how will they evacuate in an emergency? Or if somebody has a hearing disability, how will he hear the fire alarm? Okay, so you need to have audible alarms. You need to have visual alarms, which he can, some kind of flashing light, which he can physically see and understand there is an alarm. Somebody who has a hearing, a vision disability, how he will proceed to the evacuation. So all of these disabilities need to be considered when you carry out a risk assessment. Then there are lone workers. Lone workers, obviously, they are exposed to risk of violence because, especially in the case of home nurses. So healthcare workers who have to visit people in their homes to take care of elderly people or to take care of disabled people, they might be exposed to violence. Okay. Other people who can be exposed to violence are prison officers. Okay, so the officers who work in prisons, they can be exposed to violence. Also, if they are injured or ill, how they will enter into a confined space and how they will leave a confined space. So lone workers are very, very vulnerable. For example, if a lone worker has a heart attack, what we will do? So we need to give him means of communication. So we need to give him a manual call alarm button so he can press the button and he can notify other people of his emergency. So these are considerations which we need to take for various groups of people. Then there are changes. Whenever there is a change, you need to manage the change. The change which happens in a workplace, it always carries certain hazards with it. So those changes, if not managed properly, they can cause serious harm to the workers, and they can be very, very dangerous. So basically the changes, they include changes to the work processes, in the equipment, in the work practices and construction work. All of these works, even temporary works, they are considered as a change, and these changes, they need to be managed properly. Okay, so what kind of temporary works can happen in the workplace and what kind of changes can happen? Number one, we could have some short-term building project, building maintenance. This is a change. Renovation work, again, it is a change which needs to be managed properly. Renovation work and demolition, excavation, all these are works of temporary nature, and they bring about a change in the workplace, and that change needs to be managed properly. Okay, how do we mitigate or manage the impact of the change? Number one is risk assessment. Whenever a change happens, whenever a change takes place, your risk assessment must be reviewed. Okay, so risk assessment should be carried out for the work itself and the impact on the workplace. So whenever there is a change taking place, any work of temporary nature is to be carried out, for example, maintenance or whatever other activity is carried out, you need to carry out risk assessment and you need to review the existing risk assessment of the workplace. There needs to be adequate communication and cooperation between all affected parties. So if there is any construction or maintenance going on, everybody needs to be notified about that. So if people don't know what is happening, they are more likely to get injured. The competent people should be appointed, competent workers and managers should be assigned. Area should be segregated properly, work area and the area in which the temporary work is going on, it should be segregated. Emergency procedures should be put in place to manage the impact of the change, and welfare provisions should be available for all the workers as well. Okay, next is safe system of work. Safe system of work, as we discussed earlier, basically it is a formal recorded systematic examination of the work, which identifies the hazard associated with the job and defines the safe working methodology. Okay, so it is formal, which means it is official, it is recorded in a proper format. It is a systematic examination of the work. You look at your activity in a systematic manner to identify the hazards associated with that job, and then you define safe working methods as well. So usually when we carry out a safe system of work, we need to consider 4 factors in order to make the safe system of work effective. Okay. Now, in order for it to be effective, we need to consider people. We need to consider who is the safe system of work for, who is going to be involved in this safe system of work, and what is the level of competence and what kind of technical ability is required in order to make sure that the work is carried out safely. We also need to identify what equipment is going to be used, so we can identify the hazards related to that equipment as well. And we also need to identify what safety equipment will be required as well. We also need to determine what kind of materials are required, and how those your materials will be used in the workplace. And finally, we need to identify what are the environmental requirements, what kind of temperature will it be, how much light is required, and what are the space requirements as well. Okay, so in a safe system of work, basically they are linked to risk assessments, and the hazards are identified and the controls are recorded. Same happens in the risk assessment as well. They are documented so that they are clear, and they are documented so they are uniform for everyone, developed by a competent person. So safe system of work must be developed by a competent person, and he should get assistance from the workers who have experience in the job, and sometimes it is legally required. So it is the employer's responsibility to prepare a safe system of work, and the worker's responsibility to follow the safe system of work. Okay, now how do we develop a safe system of work? Basic steps include, first of all, selection of the task. So first of all, you need to select the tasks. Next, you need to record the stages of the task. Then you need to evaluate the risk associated with each step and develop a safe working methodology. Safe working methodology is basically a safe working process, how you can carry out that job safely. Then you need to implement the safe working methodology. And then finally, you need to monitor the effectiveness of the safe system of work. So this is how you develop a safe system of work. Okay, now let's consider the safe system of work for changing the wheel of a vehicle. The task, first of all, you need to look at the task. The task is changing the wheel. Now we need to break this task into small steps. First step is to park the car in a safe location. Second step is to remove the equipment from the boot. Third step is to loosen the wheel nuts. Fourth step is to jack up the car. Fifth step is to remove the wheel nuts. Sixth step is to replace the wheel and wheel nuts. Seventh step is to lower the car and remove the jack. Eighth step is to tighten the wheel nuts, and ninth step is to replace the equipment in the boot. So these are the job steps. So the job was basically, or the task was to change the wheel of a vehicle. Now we have broken it down into small job steps so we can look at them one by one. Okay, now you need to, once you've identified the job steps, now you need to identify the hazards in each step. So once you identify the hazards, then you need to identify the controls for that hazard as well. So break it down into job steps, then you identify the hazards and identify the controls for each job step. So step number one, for changing the tire, the hazards could be traffic, risk of violence. What could be the controls? Select a location which is off-road if possible. Use hazardous lights. If you feel area is unsafe at night or vulnerable, call, or if you are a vulnerable group of people, call recovery surface and stay in the car. So these are the control measures for step number one. So similarly, you can identify the hazards and control measures for each job step. Okay, now when you identify the hazards and controls, you need to consider certain things while formulating the controls and procedures. So while formulating the procedures, you need to identify all the activities that are being carried out and identify all the control measures that you have proposed. This is obviously most difficult stage in the safe system of work process. You need to consult with the workers and get their opinion and get their buy-in. If you don't have the workers on board, they might not do the job properly. So you need to allow the workers to raise their concern when you are developing the safe system of work. So after that, you need to give information, instruction, and training to the workers. So you need to give the workers training, information, and instructions on implementation of the safe system of work, and you need to provide adequate supervision to monitor it as well. Monitoring is very, very important to make sure that the safe system of work is being applied properly and is being used for the intended purpose. Next is a permit to work system. Permit to work system is a formal documented safety procedure, which is a part of a safe system of work. So for a safe system of work, basically is a high level document, and it includes various other controls as well, such as a permit to work system. A permit to work system can be used for various hazardous activities, such as a hot work. It can also be used for high voltage electrical systems, confined space entry, operational pipelines, excavations near buried services, and on complex machinery as well. Okay, so what is the process of a permit to work system? First of all, you start off with issuance of the permit. So before issuing the permit, you need to include the details of the work in the permit. You need to identify the location, give an adequate date, time, and duration in the permit. You should mention the hazards and control measures required and the PPE that are going to be used as well. Also, during issuance, you need to put the name and signature of the authorized person who is issuing the permit. So issuing of a permit is done from an issuing authority. Next is receipt. Now, once the permit is issued, there needs to be someone who is going to receive the permit. So the receiver also puts his name and signature, and then the work can start. On completion of the work, there needs to be a clearance and return to service. So permit is signed back to confirm the workers have finished their job, and then cancellation is also done, and the permit is signed to accept that the area is back under normal operation. And if extension is required, extension can be granted as well to extend the work. Last topic is emergency procedures and first aid. Whenever you are in a workplace, there are many different emergencies which can happen in a workplace. So one of the common emergency is fire. What other emergencies can we be exposed to other than fire? Other than fire, we can be exposed to bomb threats. We can be exposed to severe bad weather. We can be exposed to spillage of hazardous materials. We can be exposed to release of toxic gases, multiple casualty accidents, a terrorist or a security incident, a gas leakage. So all of these are emergencies, and they are called emergencies because these are incidents which we cannot control under normal circumstances. So despite having all the precautions in place, something can still go wrong, and that is why we need to have emergency procedures in place. Okay, so basically emergency procedure arrangements, you need to identify in an emergency response procedure, we need to identify the foreseeable. Hello, guys, you can hear me?
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir, we
Yes.
can hear you.
Okay, somebody said in the comments they can't hear me.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so when you identify the what you call it emergency arrangements that you need to include in emergency procedure, you need to identify all the foreseeable emergencies. For example, if you are working on a construction project, there can be many emergencies. There could be a fire. Okay, there could be a fall from height. There could be a vehicle accident. There could be a person stuck in a confined space. there could be a person falling from height. So there could be, if you're working in oil and gas sector, there could be a gas leakage. Okay, there could be an H2S leakage. There could be an explosion. So all of these are emergencies. So when you're developing a emergency response procedure, you need to identify all the emergency, foreseeable emergencies that can happen in that workplace. You should also mention in the emergency procedure the process of raising the fire alarm or the process of raising the emergency alarm. How will the alarm be raised? How will we notify the people that an emergency has taken place? We also need to mention what is the procedure they need to follow in case a certain emergency arises. For example, what are the things they will do in case of a fire? What are the things they will do in case of a flood? What are the actions that they will take in case of a gas leakage? What are the actions they will take in case of an earthquake? So we need to identify the foreseeable emergencies. We need to identify how alarm will be raised in those emergency, and we need to identify what the workers will do, what actions they will take, what procedures they will follow in case of that emergency. Then we need to identify suitable emergency equipment. So we need to identify what emergency equipment will be used. For example, fire extinguishers, hose reels, rescue from height equipment, tripod for rescuing from confined spaces. Then we need to identify responsible staff who is going to take actions in order to manage that emergency. So we need to identify an emergency response coordinator. We need to identify emergency response team. We need to identify a medical team, firefighting team. So we need to identify the responsible staff. We need to identify fire wardens. So we need to give them various responsibilities in an emergency. We need to identify how we will deal with the media and who will deal with the media. We need to identify how we can contact the emergency services as well. Yes, Suresh, you have a question?
Sir, this emergency procedure, flowchart, the flowchart comes under this emergency procedure.
Yes. So basically, when you develop an emergency response procedure, for each emergency, you need to develop a flow chart as well. So this flow chart basically describes the entire procedure. Okay. So flow chart will mention, for example, if somebody sees a fire, on discovery of fire, raise the fire alarm. Okay. Sorry, raise the fire alarm. Then next in the flow chart, you will mention evacuate the building, then carry out a head count, then fight the fire. So all the steps that are involved, all the steps that we discussed here, they will be given in the form of a flow chart. So you can develop flow chart. It's not necessary to develop a flow chart, but it is a good idea to develop a flow chart as well. So this will tell you how you need to manage the emergency and what procedure you need to follow in order to manage that emergency. Also in the emergency procedure, you need to identify the emergency procedure arrangements. You need to identify what kind of equipment you will use for communication. So whether you will use landline, mobile phones, satellite phones, radios, walkie-talkies. So you need to identify what equipment will be used during the emergency for communication. You need to mention the emergency contact details in the emergency procedure. So you need to mention the national and local numbers. For example, if there is an emergency in UAE, the number which we call is 999. Okay, so 999 is the emergency response contact number in the UAE. In USA, it is 911. In Pakistan, it's 1122. In other countries, there are various numbers available. So you need to identify what are the emergency contact numbers, and the workers, they need to be familiar with those emergency contact numbers as well. And then we also need to identify the responsible individuals. So make an organization chart for emergency response team and post it on the notice boards as well. Obviously, training and testing is also required for emergencies. So in case of an emergency, we need to make sure that people are prepared, people are ready. So people need to be trained in their roles in an emergency. They need to be trained on how to use the equipment, how to safely handle the equipment in emergency, and emergency procedures should be practiced through drills and exercises. So we need to develop a drill schedule and carry out drills regularly in order to make the people familiar. Okay, when an emergency happens, obviously it's an unexpected situation and people get injured. So our aim should be to protect the workers and make sure that we provide first aid arrangements as well. So first aid arrangements have to be provisioned properly. So usually we need to provide various facilities for first aid. We need to provide an appropriate location where we can give first aid treatment, such as a first aid station or a site clinic. We also need to provide first aid equipment, such as first aid kits, first aid boxes. So these first aid kits or boxes should be suitably stocked. And we also need to provide other equipment such as AED or an automatic electric defibrillator. If somebody gets a heart attack, we can use the AED to give them a shock to get the heart pumping again. So we need to train the workers as well so they can administer the first aid in order to save the life. First aid facilities and equipment. So basically various facilities which we provide, they should be centrally located and they should be accessible by emergency services. They should be clean and adequately heated and ventilated. They should be properly lit as well. Hand washing facilities, chairs, clinical bin waste, etc. should be provided as well. The equipment that we need to provide, first aid equipment we need to provide is first aid kits, high wash station, emergency showers, blankets, splints, resuscitation equipment, stretchers. Splints are basically to keep your broken arms and broken legs in a proper position. Okay, splints are deflatable and there are wooden splints as well which you can use. So these basically keep, if you get a broken arm or a broken leg, the splint will help keep it straight. Then resuscitation equipment such as AED defibrillator as well, stretchers, wheelchairs, and other equipment which is required. We should also include that as well. Now, basically, when you provide first aid personnel, you need to make sure that you have adequate personnel available to give first aid to the people. Now, the people who you are training to become first aiders, they need to understand the 3 P's. Okay, what are the 3 P's? The 3 P's of first aid are: number one, the main purpose of giving first aid is to preserve life. To preserve life, to prevent deterioration of the injured person, and to promote recovery. First aid is never ever given as a treatment. First aid is not a treatment. Okay, first aid is given to preserve life, to prevent deterioration, and to promote recovery as well. So these are the 3 P's, and this is the main purpose of providing first aid. Okay, when you're providing first aid facilities or first aid personnel in your workplace, you need to make sure that you have adequate trained personnel available. You need to give appointed persons. Usually there is no basic training required for appointed person, but then you need to assign emergency first aiders as well. Emergency first aiders, they are full trained first aiders, and they need to give advanced what you call it first aid training as well, so that they can provide first aid. Yes, somebody raised a hand or somebody posted a question.
Sir, I have a question.
Yes.
Prevent deterioration. Is it the prevent further harm? You can say.
Yes, deterioration means worsening. Prevent deterioration is to prevent further harm to the person. Deterioration means worsening or further harm. So deterioration is to prevent further harm to the injured person. Okay.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Okay, so when you are providing first aid personnel and first aid provisions, you need to consider various factors. So what are the factors that you will consider while providing first aid facilities? You will look at the general risk level of the workplace. If the risk level of the workplace is high, you need to give additional first aid personnel and you need to give additional first aid facilities. So you also need to consider the hazards present in the workplace. So if there are sharps in the workplace, if there are the hazards of cutting, lacerations is high, then you need to give more bandages as well. You need to look at the accident history to decide on the first aid provisions. You need to look at the various vulnerable people which are present in your workplace. You need to consider the total number of workers while providing first aid provisions as well. You need to look at the work patterns and the shifts as well, the location of the workplace. So you need to consider whether workplace is near the hospital or far from the hospital, whether you need an ambulance or not. You also need to look at the size and spread of the workplace as well while deciding the first aid provisions for a workplace. Okay, when you're selecting staff to be first aiders, you need to make sure that you select the right people for this job. First aiders are very important position, so they need to be reliable. So they need to be people who remain calm and who have good communication skills. They need to be aware of their own limitations and of the training as well. So they should not consider themselves to be doctors. They are only first aiders. Okay, so they need to know their limitations. They need to have the ability to absorb new knowledge and to learn. They should have the ability to cope with stressful situations. They need to be able to accept responsibility, physically fit enough to do the first aid. And also you need to, we need to give consideration of the need for first aiders, considering their gender, ethnicity, and religious convictions. And we must also be able make sure that they should be able to be released from normal duties to attend to an incident. So these are all the factors that we need to consider while selecting staff for being first aiders. Okay, guys, so this is the end of element number 3. As you guys have seen, this is the biggest chapter of the entire IGC. So in this element, we discussed the concept of safety culture and we discussed the significance of managing health and safety in an organization. We discussed how safety culture can be improved. We discussed the human factors that can influence the safety behavior at work. We discussed the principles of risk assessment and the 5 steps of risk assessment. We also discussed the controls associated with management of change in the workplace. We discussed about safe systems of work. We discussed permit to work system, emergency procedures, and first aid provisions in the workplace. So guys, this is the end of element number 3. This is the biggest chapter of the entire IGC. So we need to give a lot of focus on the element number 3. And before I end this session, just want to remind you guys that the exam is scheduled for 9th of June and today is 7th of May. So there is only 1 month left in the exam. So I would suggest you guys to start practicing now, start reading the books, start practicing the questions as well. I will share with you guys a few mock exams. I would request you guys to start working and preparing towards and try to solving those mock exams as well. Next week, we're going to start element number 4. Once we complete element number 4, I'm going to ask you guys to do a practice exam. So I will give you guys a question paper and I want you guys to solve that question paper and give it to me so I can give you my comments and tell you what your mistakes are so you can correct them before the exam. Okay, guys, that's the end of today's session. Do you guys have any questions for today?